We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, new topics every day. We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's January 10th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun. I'm the news anchor of Arirang's new daily morning program, News Generation, where young people make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Ji-hee.
Good morning, Yeun.
Welcome to have you here.
Thank you.
She's here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. Now, the topic that we have for you today is North Korea, how we, the new generation, view North Korea. But before we do that, let's go on to our news feed. Every day we'll make a news feed for the new generation, and they'll be the top 3 news stories that interest and affect those in their 20s and 30s. Now, if you take a look at the screen, we have 3 hashtags that sum each story up. Today, we have hashtag It Was a Close One, hashtag CVS Coffee, and hashtag Hero Hits 2 million. Now, I'll start with the first hashtag. Yesterday, our phones were ringing with text messages warning residents not to go outside. And that's because a U.S. observation satellite named Earth Radiation Budget Satellite, ERBS for short, had re-entered the planet's atmosphere. The Ministry of Science and ICT warned that this retired satellite could actually cause damage on the Korean peninsula at around 12:20 p.m. to 1:20 p.m. Korea time. But later in the afternoon, officials found out that the satellite had passed. They didn't specify whether that meant it burned up over Korea or it had come down elsewhere, but no damage has been reported since. Further details on the 5,400-pound spacecraft will be updated by the U.S. Combined Space Operations Center, and the ERBS was launched on October 5th, 1984, and completed its mission in 2005. Now, I hear you have another story for us, Ji-hee.
That's right. So it's not new that South Korea's coffee consumption has been constantly rising because we have growing popularity here among the people. However, with the historically high inflation hitting the globe, South Korea not being an exception, coffee prices in cafes in particular have gone up as well. So people have turned to convenience store coffees instead of buying coffee from large franchises or smaller cafes, and there's a growing perception that these CVS coffees are more cost-effective. And while the price of coffee at large franchises or smaller cafes ranges between 2,000 and 5,000 won usually, the ones sold in convenience stores are only just over 1,000 won, which is around $1. Convenience store coffees sales between 6 and 10 a.m. when office workers usually go to work have risen by 24% on month. So we can really see that inflation is affecting our consumption trends.
I see. And Ji-hee, I hear that you have another story for us, right?
That's right. So some entertainment news we have. Hero, or Yeongung in Korean, the musical to screen movie about Korean independence fighter An Jung-gun, has reached over 2 million viewers, and that's just within 18 days of its release. And it's remaining at number 2 at the box office as well, and it's faster at going over 2 million views compared to other famous musical movies. What's also unprecedented is for the movie that it stayed at number 2 for the 3rd consecutive week, and the total admissions account for 33.1% of all the seats available in the theaters right now. So we're hoping to see the viewers go past 3 million even just after the Lunar New Year's holiday.
All right, I'll have to see it myself to be included in those numbers. All right, thank you so much for making our news feed of the day. And News Gen will discuss different topics each day. If you take a look at the screen to see what we have prepared for you today. Korea, still divided after more than 7 decades. Following the end of World War II in August 1945, the Soviet Union and United States split the Korean peninsula into 2. Above the 38th parallel was the Soviet-backed North, and below became the US-backed South. From 1950, the Korean War raged for 3 years. At least 2.5 million people lost their lives. But only an armistice was signed in 1953, which created the DMZ, a demilitarized zone separating South and North. More than 7 decades have passed since then, and the 2 Koreas remain as divided as ever. Starting with Kim Il-sung, 3 generations of Kims have held the position of supreme leader in the North. Meanwhile, 14 presidents have served office in South Korea. The 2 Koreas continue to walk on thin ice, as nuclear threats and provocations flare up tensions. Today, NewsGen aims to tackle 3 points. 1. Uncovering North Korea based on recent headlines. 2. Looking into how the new generation perceives Pyongyang. 3. How the new gen can achieve peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, it's definitely a topic that we discuss frequently here in the newsroom. It's also a topic that I've talked about with my friends both here and outside of Korea. And for the first part of our discussion, we aim to take a closer look at North Korea through the headlines. Ji-hee, what's the first thing that comes up to your mind when you think about North Korea?
Well, North Korea is obviously a very isolated country, and the first image that comes up to mind is the image of Kim Jong-un, because he's the most frequently appearing person on media outlets. And also I can think of the synchronized moves that we see of the armies and the people. Yes, and I even remember the squad from the Winter Olympics too. They were so synchronized in their moves, yes. And also, of course, nuclear weapons and human rights issues, including starvation as well.
Right, and we've also seen North Korea hit a lot of news headlines this year and even last year as well. Which of these news headlines shocked you or affected you the most?
Well, North Korea really had a record-busting 2022. It fired more missiles than ever in just 1 year alone. But apart from all these hostilities we often see about, and to be honest, many Koreans, including myself, are quite desensitized with all these provocation and hostilities. So I want to move us back further in the past to actually year 2011, because that's the most memorable moment for me in particular. It made a huge impact on me because that was when the father of the current leader, Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, died. It was a pretty sudden death, and it was a news that was particularly alarming for me because I thought that without Kim Jong-il, North Korea would collapse, literally. But I was too naive, I was young, I was not as knowledgeable as I am now. And it turned out that Kim Jong-un, even though he's a millennial himself, he turned out to be even more hawkish with his regime.
Right, I don't want to consider yourself to be naive because I too also thought we all hoped for better two-Korea relations. All right, Ji-hee, you'll be joining us for extended talks with 2 special guests. We'll be connecting live to 2 of them, one being James Fretwell, an analyst from NK News, an American news outlet specifically covering North Korea, and Pagani, a North Korean defector. And some of you may be familiar with her because she's appeared in a famous TV show here in Korea that's featuring other North Korean defectors. Now, if you want to see our discussions, please stay in tune. All right, as we mentioned before, we have a very special guest connected online, an expert in North Korea. He's James Fretwell, analyst at NK News, and one of his latest articles that caught my interest was in December, where he analyzed main developments in December that North Korea had made and prospected on what would happen this year. Welcome to have you, James.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
All right, now before we begin, based on how you're so up to date with North Korea and North Korean news, could you give us a timeline of Pyongyang's latest provocations?
Sure, I mean, you gave such a great historical overview at the beginning of the show. I'll kind of bring you up to speed on events in the last month or so, which was a really mammoth month for North Korea. Can't cover everything, in fact, but I think one of the most important developments was in mid-December when Kim Jong-un guided a test for a new solid fuel rocket engine. Now, this is important because it probably will be used for a solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. Now, you might be thinking, well, North Korea perhaps could already hit the continental US with the Hwasong 17 ICBM that it launched this year, or maybe the Hwasong 14 or 15 that it launched back all the way back in 2017. So why is this solid fuel one big news? Well, because with a solid fuel ICBM, you don't have to take as much time to prepare to launch it. It already comes in a fueled state, unlike North Korea's existing missiles. So if North Korea was to perfect this technology, it would be able to prepare an attack a long-distance attack on the US, and the US and South Korea would have very little time to react to that. Other big developments, we had Kim Jong-un gifting 30 new units of a super large multiple launch rocket system that can hit, he said, anywhere in South Korea. Oh, and by the way, he added that they're nuclear capable. And of course, we had the North Korean drones that crossed the border into the south a few weeks ago, which the South Korean military really struggled to respond to.
Right, so definitely we can diagnose that tensions are still flaring and will continue to do so. But if you can mention briefly why this affects the new generation both here and outside of Korea.
Well, I think generally speaking, the new generation in South Korea and outside of Korea doesn't actually pay as much attention to North Korea as you might expect. And in a way, can you blame them that much? I mean, there's so much going on in the world right now, right? There's tensions between the US and China over Taiwan and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think that North Korea got as much attention in previous years to a certain extent because it's been overshadowed by these issues. And this is despite it launching more missiles than ever before in 2022. North Korea is stronger than ever before. And actually as well, I think Donald Trump also brought a lot of attention to the North Korea issue. Back in 2017, whether he was threatening fire and fury and retaliation to North Korean weapons tests, or whether, a year later he was having his famous summits with Kim Jong-un, whether you agreed with Trump's approach to North Korea or not, he did bring a lot of attention to the issue. Now, the new generations should be paying attention to North Korea, though, because it is a tinderbox of problems, and the right spark could set the whole place alight. North Korea is a country that denies people its basic freedoms, its economy pales in comparison to the South. And if North Korea collapses and goes down all guns blazing, this not only presents a problem to those living in South Korea, who are, of course, right next to North Korea, it presents a threat to Japan, just across from Korea, and also because of North Korea's long-range nuclear weapons, a danger to the United States.
All right, and James, I think that because there's a difference in how the older generation perceives North Korea to ours, we have to find a reason why. And as you briefly mentioned, there's just a lot of different news that's happening to them. But I also want to point out to that fact that media can play a part, right? Like we've seen more K-dramas and movies on North Korean defectors. We've seen an abundance of content. Do you think that affects the new generation's perception on North Korea?
To a certain extent, I think it does. There have been movies about North Korea and the division of North Korea, those kind of issues for a while now. And, in many cases, actually, if you watch them, they might start out with some conflict between the North Korean and South Korean characters. But in a lot of these movies, the kind of underlying message at the end seems to be that despite North and South's differences, both ideological and their troubled history, they're the same people. And at the end, they should be able to come together. And isn't it a tragedy that they can't? A very popular drama recently, for example, was Crash Landing on You in 2020. And this is about a romance between a North Korean soldier and a South Korean businesswoman who found herself on the wrong side of the DMZ after a paragliding accident. But actually, unfortunately, when I think of a drama that more represents how the younger generations think about North Korea, I think about Netflix's Korean remake of Money Heist. Now, this takes place in a world where North and South Korea have taken steps to integrate their economies, but instead of this happy, unified Korea, it leads to high crime, exploitation, and massive inequality. And these are issues that if you look at statistics, this is what young people are really concerned about when it comes to the Korean unification.
Right. Well, thank you so much, James. You've provided a very good insight for us. It was a pleasure getting to hear from you. Thank you so much joining us through Zoom.
Thank you very much.
All right, now coming back to the studio, Chi-hee, you saw some of the questions answered in James' interview, and we briefly talked about North Korean defectors and the content, and I was wondering, have you ever seen any of those, or have you ever met any defectors in person?
Right, so firstly, I want to mention briefly about the South Korean content that involve North Korean topics, and I wondered if these contents about North Korea did actually affect us and our perception of North Korea. And as our expert James has mentioned, it does to a certain extent do definitely affect our perception of North Korea. And it did for me too, personally. He mentioned the famous Korean drama, Crash Landing on You. And I also want to mention the famous movie, 공조 as well, which is in English, it's translated into English as well. And so I also wanted to mention about the defectors as well. I did actually have a chance to meet one of the defectors personally.
I see.
Yes, it was a luncheon between one of the U.S. Army officials and a defector, and I got to listen to their personal experiences living in North Korea. And since we have another North Korean defector online waiting for us, I'm sure we will be able to listen more about her stories as well.
Right, as you mentioned, Chi-hee, for those of you who haven't met a North Korean defector in your life before, we actually have with us connected via Skype a North Korean defector who is willing to share her story and her insight today. It's actually Park Eun-hee joining us through Skype. Park Eun-hee, glad to have you here.
Hello.
Thank you for having me today.
All right, Eun-hee, please introduce yourself and tell us why you decided to defect to South Korea.
Hi, my name is Eun-hee Park, and I'm a North Korean defector who escaped for freedom at the age of 21 from Wonsan, which is on the east coast of North Korea. And as I mentioned, like I escaped for my individual freedom by watching South Korean dramas illegally, and I got an idea that like I had a chance to enjoy my indirect freedom, and then at the age of 17, I decided to leave my country for freedom.
I see. So for the thought of freedom, and Chi-hee, I think you may have a lot of questions you might want to ask her.
That's right. So, Eun-hee, what did you think of what South Korea's new generation had to say about North Korea and what the perception that they have towards North Korea?
To speaking about the new generation in South Korea, based on my experience at the university, at Chungang University, I was studying business administration, and they see North Koreans as strangers, or maybe some of them see as one of us, but mostly not interested about North Korea. That's sad, but it's a fact. When I asked my friend classmate, like, what do you think of me? And she said, at the first time, I was shocked when you introduced me as a North Korean defector, but I don't see you as a North Korean defector. You are my classmate and sister. It's
Right.
it's diversity in Seoul, so they see us as one of the strangers from other countries.
Right, definitely. Because at the end of the day, we're just all human beings. There's no need to classify us. But I do want to ask, how does the new Korean generation, or the North Korean new generation, that is, think about reunification? Were there any talks about that?
So definitely new generation in North Korea hope that one day North Korea and South Korea will be one country, as a priority hope, but in South Korea it's completely different. But I can say like society, as a government perspective in North Korea, they do brainwash us that we have to make a unify the Korea by like having the power of from the North Korean government. But as a new generation in North Korea, for me, it wasn't very much for me. I didn't think about the reunification as my priority, because since I watched the South Korean dramas illegally, I just like want to go to that country that I can belong, that I can be who I am.
All right.
So because of the personal hope that we can think about reunification.
Right. Thank you so much, Eun-hee. I think that was a really good note to end on. That was Park Eun-hee joining us via Skype. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And if we change gears, given that we are a live morning program, we always ask our viewers questions related to our discussion topic in advance, and we use this time to share with you what they had to say. So we asked our viewers what popped up in their head when thinking about North Korea, whether the two Koreas should unify, and what's left for the new gen to solve. If you take a look at the screen, Kyuhyun Kim, Nathan7284, said he thought of North Korea's famous news anchor, and I think he's referring to Lee Chun-hee, that is, the news presenter for North Korean broadcaster Korean Central Television. He also mentioned that there's a ton of memes on the internet presenting with Lee Chun-hee presenting the news. Then we have Michael Pang 4856 said that the two Koreas should just reunite because at the end of the day, they're the same people and they have the same ancestry. Last but not least, Tiras Bell 4740 said the new gen should solve the humanitarian crisis, mainly starvation and executions that has concerned many in the international society. Now, if we bring back our talks here in the studio, Ji-hee, what do you have to say on our viewers' comments?
Well, first of all, Kyuhyun, we also very well know of this famous news anchor of North Korea, yes, and not just memes, but I've seen people mimic her as well here in South Korea, right? She's a very famous figure. And I also want to mention Michael for mentioning the fact that we are all same descendants of the same ancestors. I totally agree, and eventually I believe that we should move towards unification eventually, although right now the hostilities must be settled down. And also, lastly, we have the comment regarding the humanitarian crisis, which I also wanted to point out, because as you mentioned, executions have been carried out because of people watching content of South Korea, and that just doesn't make sense. But this is happening in North Korea, and I just wanted to point out that we should all be more interested in the humanitarian issues that take place in North Korea. Yes,
definitely, which brings us to the last part of our discussion, what we, the new generation, want from the two Koreas. And as our viewers mentioned, reunification remains a major issue, right, Ji-hee?
That's right. So to be realistic, it's not possible for us to reunify right now because, of course, the Korean Peninsula, its tensions are escalating ever more. And people often compare our situation with the reunification of the East and West Germany as well, but then their context is very different from ours. And we've got so much to consider, and we've been divided for decades now. So we're quite different. And I've heard an analogy of a person saying it's like twins who've been adopted to other environments. It's just like that. But then we at the end want to connect. So eventually, I say we should reunify in a very unique form.
Right, in a unique form, but at the end of the day, just to achieve peace and prosperity for all the people.
That's right.
All right, today we talked about how the new generation perceives North Korea, and though we might not look at the North in the same way as previous generations, one thing is for sure, North Korea still remains a country of concern and interest, whether that's due to unsolved humanitarian issues or the security threats we see on news headlines. Now, we'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you the topics that young people are talking about. Special thanks to Ji-hee.
Thank you very much.
She was here in the studio, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow morning because we are
News Generation.